Now, let's talk about time, the precious commodity you had absolutely none of as a World War II codebreaker. You didn't get to choose your hours. Your hours were dictated by the constant rush to stay ahead of the enemy. The ticking clock wasn't just something you could ignore. It was your constant companion. With every code you cracked, you knew there was another waiting for you. And if you didn't crack it in time, well, your side might be blindsided by an enemy attack. That's not the kind of pressure you'd want on your shoulders, right? But that's exactly what you faced every single day. And let's be real, the pressure was brutal. Imagine sitting at a desk for hours, no days surrounded by papers. Chalkboards filled with equations, a massive Enigma machine humming in the background. You're working non-stop, fueled by coffee, adrenaline, and a hint of desperation. Your eyes are blurry, your fingers aching from typing, and yet the pressure never lets up. There's no such thing as a day off when you're a codebreaker. It doesn't matter if you're exhausted, mentally drained, or just plain fed up. The clock's still ticking. The war's still going on. Your job doesn't stop. And speaking of that clock, how about the constant reminder that any mistake you make could cost lives? You could be the difference between success and failure in a critical mission. And here's where the pressure ratchets up even more. You might never know if your breakthrough saved anyone, or if your work was even used. You won't know if your deciphered code led to a victory, or if it was just one piece in the massive puzzle that somehow never fully came together. It's the ultimate gamble, where your efforts are as important as they are invisible. But the lack of time wasn't just about getting results, it was also about getting results fast enough. There were times when you had to decipher a code in a matter of hours, sometimes minutes, depending on the urgency of the message. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? You're staring at a page full of nonsensical letters, knowing that if you don't figure this out immediately, someone might die. The weight of it was unbearable. The mental strain of pushing yourself, night after night, to crack codes was relentless. You'd constantly question whether it was all worth it. But here's the reality. This isn't a job where you get instant feedback. No one's going to slap you on the back after you solve a code. You're stuck in a room, all alone, staring at a screen or piece of paper, and the world keeps moving on outside. No applause, no recognition. The only acknowledgement you might get is a quiet nod from your superior, but that's about it. It's about doing your part without ever really knowing how much of an impact you're having. And even when you did crack a code, the task was never over. It was a never-ending cycle. Every time you solved one message, another came in. And that's what would wear you down over time. There was no moment of rest, no chance to step back and say, I did it. You would look back at the pile of codes you had cracked, but you wouldn't feel satisfaction. You would just see more codes, more work ahead. There was no relief in sight. If anything, the sense of accomplishment became fleeting. There was always more to be done, more to be decoded. It was a job without finish lines, with victory always just out of reach. In fact, even when you cracked the Enigma or any other difficult code, you knew that the Germans were constantly updating their systems. Just when you thought you had them beat, they would change something, throw in a new trick, and you'd be back to square one. There was no time to celebrate, no time to savor your victory. The challenge was perpetual, and the stakes never lowered. As the war dragged on, the fatigue became overwhelming. Your body couldn't keep up with the relentless hours. You might have been working through the night, but by the time the sun came up, your mind was a foggy mess. It was hard to focus, hard to think. The exhaustion set in. The pressure built up, and it wasn't just the physical toll. It was the emotional strain. you would have moments of doubt. What if you missed something? What if you were wrong? What if your code meant nothing? What if your work wasn't making a difference at all? This unrelenting pace wore many codebreakers down. The lack of time wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a constant source of stress, eroding your mental and emotional well-being. There was always something more to decode, always another layer to peel back. You couldn't afford to pause, to take a breather, and that was the trap of it all. When you're in the thick of things, in that high-pressure environment, you don't get the luxury of thinking things through calmly. There's no space for reflection. It's all about survival. And here's the thing, it wasn't just about time, it was about the lack of it. You'd never know if your breakthrough was enough. You'd never see the full picture. You'd never know the exact moment your work saved thousands of lives. You'd just have to trust that what you were doing was making a difference. And that's a tough pill to swallow, isn't it? The emotional toll of not knowing if your hard work was enough to turn the tide of the war well. That's not something most people could handle. It was a job where mental endurance was just as important as intellectual ability. The ability to push through, to keep working despite the pressure, despite the fatigue, was what kept Codebreakers going. But let's be honest, the Enigma machine, the name alone, sounds like something straight out of a spy novel, right? And to be honest, it almost was. But this was no fictional gadget, no cool piece of secret technology from a Hollywood blockbuster. The Enigma was real, and for a long time, it felt completely unbreakable. A perfect cipher, machine impossible to crack at least that's what the Germans thought. You, however, would have known better. If you were a codebreaker, you knew better than to assume anything was truly unbreakable. But let's be clear, breaking the Enigma was no walk in the park. Picture this, the Enigma machine was a complex contraption of gears, rotors, and switches. Each time you pressed a key, the machine would scramble the letter you typed into something else entirely completely random, and yet completely systematic. For anyone who didn't know the settings, it was a nightmare. The Germans believed the Enigma was secure. Each military unit had its own settings, and with the machine's vast number of possible configurations, roughly 150 quintillion, it was a problem no one thought could be solved. You'd probably be thinking, that's it, I'm toast. But here's the kicker. You're not just dealing with the machine itself. You've got human error on the other side. The Germans, in all their confidence, made mistakes. Sometimes they repeated words or phrases in the messages, even when they thought they were being cautious. And that's where you'd start to get your foothold. You would have learned to look for patterns, those little, human-made errors that no encryption could hide forever. Because even with the best technology, humans are, well, human. They slip up, and you were looking for those slips like a hawk. It wasn't glamorous work. No, it was about brute force, unending patience, and a lot of trial and error. But when you spotted those little cracks in the machine, it felt like you were breaking into a vault. The problem was, the Germans kept changing things. Every day, they could reconfigure the Enigma settings, making your job even harder. One slip-up on your part, one moment of missing a clue, and it all could fall apart. And while you might have felt like a genius for figuring it out, the real kicker was knowing that the Germans were working around the clock to adapt, making sure their codes got harder and harder. It was like a twisted game of chess, with no guarantee you'd ever checkmate. But let's talk about the machine's real magic. It wasn't just about cracking one message. No, it was about cracking all the messages. You weren't just guessing one set of letters. You were unlocking entire communication networks, a web of espionage, commands, and strategic military movements. Every successful decryption felt like you'd uncovered the enemy's deepest secrets. But here's the thing, you couldn't just stop after one victory. There was always another message, always another code to break, another line of numbers to decode. You could never rest by now. You've probably realized something. This isn't a job for someone who likes things easy. You wouldn't just be sitting around, sipping coffee, cracking codes with ease. The Enigma was a beast, and it didn't play fair. It wasn't just about brains. It was about persistence. It was about working through the frustration, the failure, and the uncertainty. When you cracked one code, the sense of relief was fleeting, because another one was waiting for you. This constant cycle of success and failure could easily wear you down. And as you tried to keep up with the pace, you would have to keep your cool, keep your wits sharp, because a single misstep could cost you everything. Now, imagine the moment you finally cracked the Enigma code. After hours of frustration, of staring at the machine with nothing but a sense of defeat, you get that one breakthrough. Suddenly, you're holding the keys to the enemy's entire communication system. It's a rush. It's like you've just figured out the puzzle no one else could solve. But don't get too comfortable. The enemy will adapt, the machine will change, and you'll be back at square one. It's like a cruel game that never ends. As difficult as it was to crack the Enigma, you knew that getting it wrong wasn't just about a missed opportunity. It could alter the entire course of a battle or worse, a war. There's a saying that war is fought on multiple fronts, but when you're a codebreaker, you're constantly battling against the clock, against the complexity of the code, and against the enemy's relentless attempts to outsmart you. You weren't just fighting a machine, you were fighting to stay one step ahead of history itself. But the Enigma wasn't the only challenge. After all, the world of cryptography is vast. Even if you did crack one code, there was always another, one waiting to be broken. The stakes were high, the pressure was constant, and the burden of failure was a heavy weight on your shoulders. The entire Allied effort relied on people like you, sitting in dark rooms, decoding messages that could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers on the front lines. You weren't just doing a job, you were carrying the responsibility of a whole world on your shoulders. In the end, the Enigma was just the tip of the iceberg. The real challenge lay in making sense of what you decoded. A message might be cracked, but you still had to interpret it correctly. The codebreakers were constantly engaged in a battle of wits trying to figure out not just what the enemy was saying, but why they were saying it, and what it meant in the grand scheme of things. And while breaking the Enigma machine might have felt like an epic win, the battle was far from over. The war for information was relentless, and you were in the heart of it. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the world of World War II codebreakers. Imagine the flicker of dim lights in a room full of hums and clicks, walls closing in on you as you squint at endless strings of gibberish on the paper in front of you. You're not just cracking codes, you're unraveling the fate of nations. Oh, and you probably won't survive this. No big deal, right? Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and if you feel like it, drop your location and local time in the comments, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the scene. You're in a cold, windowless room where the air is thick with pressure. The faint hum of a machine in the corner is your only company. You're surrounded by paper, crammed with strange symbols and numbers, none of them making any sense. This is your life now, life dedicated to decoding messages from the enemy, unraveling secrets hidden in seemingly nonsensical strings of letters. The Enigma machine, a device that's become a symbol of wartime secrecy, hums in the back of your mind, a constant reminder of the monumental task you've been given. You aren't just a soldier, you're a mind warrior, armed with nothing but your intellect and sheer determination. You're not in a battlefield, but the war is just as real. And like any battlefield, survival isn't guaranteed. The thing is, you probably wouldn't last long in this world, the enemy being part of something bigger. But the truth is far grimmer. It wasn't all high fives and celebratory cigars. It wasn't even about feeling like you were the star of the show. Instead, you spent hours, days, weeks, sometimes even months, staring at letters and numbers, trying to find patterns. You were fighting a battle of the mind, and it was exhausting. Each code you cracked was a victory, but each victory only led to more codes. It wasn't glamorous. You were often stuck alone, in isolation, with no clue if what you were doing was even going to make a difference. And you had no control over when or if you'd ever see the results. Codebreakers were largely unsung heroes, toiling away in secrecy. Even the slightest mistake could have fatal consequences. One wrong move could mislead the Allies into thinking the enemy was headed in one direction when they were actually planning an attack elsewhere. The life of a codebreaker was filled with moments of doubt. Could you crack it? Or was it too complicated this time? What if you failed? And that's just the beginning of why you'd struggle to survive in this world. Let's talk about time, because you didn't have much of it. Imagine the pressure of knowing that every minute you spent struggling with an encryption was another minute your enemy could use to advance. It's a ticking clock in your head, but it's not one you can control. You work around the clock, fueled by caffeine and the faint hope that you'll break the code, just like in the movies. But that's not the reality. Your days blurred together. The codes get harder, the hours longer, and the mental fatigue piles up. You might even forget what the outside world looks like, with no clear escape. No time for a break, no time to think about anything but the cipher in front of you. Then there's the isolation. This wasn't like an office job where you could take a stroll for a coffee break or chat with coworkers. No, you'd be in a small, dimly lit room for hours on end, with the world beyond your door a distant memory. It was a world of quiet pressure. Sometimes, all you'd have for company were the numbers, and sure, you might share a brief conversation with colleagues, but it was mostly focused on the code. Small talk, that's for the movies. This was about survival through sheer focus. Everyone was just as consumed as you were. For long stretches of time, you wouldn't be able to talk about what you were doing with anyone. The weight of secrecy bore down on you. And when you did break through a code, there were no high fives, no applause, just the quiet satisfaction that maybe, just maybe, you made a small difference. And while we're talking about the pressure, let's not forget the stress. Code breaking was intense, mentally intense. You were not just decoding messages, you were reading the enemy's mind. Every encrypted message was a glimpse into the enemy's strategy. One wrong guess, one mistake in your process, and you could be giving your side false information. It wasn't just about breaking the code anymore, it was about outsmarting a machine. The Enigma wasn't just a machine. It was a fortress of complexity, a constant reminder that if you didn't crack the code in time, the consequences could be disastrous. You weren't just cracking a code, you were playing the role of a high-stakes chess player, one move away from losing it all. Imagine it. A small mistake leads to failure. A failure leads to death. That's the kind of pressure you're under. The mental strain would start to tear away at your sense of reality. You'd question yourself, was this ever going to work? Was it even worth it? The people who survived this world weren't just brilliant minds, they were incredibly tough ones, able to endure the psychological toll without cracking under the weight of failure. But here's the kicker. It was a job that no one really saw. The success you helped bring about wasn't for you to claim. The military was all about teamwork, sure, but the glory went to the generals and the soldiers on the front lines. Codebreakers, they were just a nameless, faceless crew working behind the scenes. In fact, many of them didn't even get credit for their work until long after the war ended. By then, most of them had moved on. The job they did, the lives they saved, forgotten. You wouldn't have the luxury of a parade or a medal for your service, your reward. Maybe, just maybe, a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that you helped win the war, even if no one knew your name. In the end, life as a codebreaker during World War II was a tough one. No fame, no glory, no recognition. You had to have a level of mental fortitude that most people simply didn't possess. You might think you could hack it, that the excitement and challenge would keep you going. But the reality, it's not as glamorous as it sounds. You wouldn't last long under the weight of it all, not without cracking, and even if you did survive, you probably wouldn't come out the same. Let's talk about the most exhausting aspect of being a World War II codebreaker, the mental toll. Now, when we think of war, we typically imagine soldiers battling on the front lines, fighting physical battles. But what if I told you that the battle inside your own mind was just as fierce, if not fiercer? For you as a codebreaker, the front lines were made of numbers, letters, and ciphers, and you were constantly waging war against your own sanity. Imagine the intense focus required to crack just a single message. It wasn't just about looking at the letters and numbers. It was about seeing things others couldn't. It was about connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated characters and hoping you were on the right track. One wrong guess could mean weeks of wasted work and the potential for misinformation that could cost lives. You'd be staring at your notes, hoping for a spark of inspiration, but often only feeling the crushing weight of your mental fatigue. Every moment you spent solving a code was another moment your mind was stretched to its limits. You'd constantly be second-guessing yourself. Were you right? Could there be another interpretation? Even the smallest mistake could send your entire operation into chaos. It wasn't just about cracking codes. It was about maintaining the mental clarity to avoid those costly errors. The longer you worked, the more your mind would begin to fray. You'd start to doubt your judgment, overthink every decision, and wonder if your brain had become too exhausted to continue. And let's not forget the paranoia. In an environment where trust was limited, you would constantly worry about what others were doing, especially since your every move was so crucial to the war effort. Every colleague in the room could be the difference between success and failure. Were they as sharp as you? Could they be hiding something from you? The isolation and the secrecy created a culture of suspicion. In this world, you had to trust no one, completely, not even yourself sometimes. It was a constant psychological battle, a war not just against the enemy, but against your own mind. You might think you'd be able to handle it. After all, you'd be a hero, right? Someone who could piece together the puzzle and unravel the mysteries of the enemy. But the truth is, no one, no matter how sharp they work, could do it without paying a price. Even the brightest minds would buckle under the strain. The constant mental exercise required to keep up with the ever-evolving codes was grueling. Your mind would burn out, piece by piece, as you tried to keep pace with the enemy's constant efforts to stay ahead of you. And as the war went on, the codes grew more complex, the machines more advanced, and the pressure greater. It wasn't just about cracking Enigma anymore. It was about staying ahead of an entire system that was evolving in real time. The further you went into this world of cryptography, the more you realized just how punishing it was. You weren't just solving puzzles, you were constantly fighting to keep your sanity intact. For many, the mental toll became too much. It wasn't uncommon for codebreakers to experience extreme fatigue, anxiety, and even depression. Some cracked under the pressure and had to be pulled from the front lines of cryptography. They couldn't keep up with the demands, couldn't stay sharp enough to crack the codes, and who could blame them? There was no escape from the mental weight. It wasn't just about intellect, it was about endurance. You had to outlast the pressure, the doubt, and the exhaustion, all while maintaining the clarity of mind necessary to do the job. This mental exhaustion wasn't just a temporary thing either. After the war ended, many codebreakers found it difficult to readjust to civilian life. They had spent so long in that high-stakes, high-pressure environment that they didn't know how to cope with the quiet, routine world they were re-entering. The post-war transition for many was incredibly difficult. They had given their all to something that few understood and even fewer appreciated. And now they were left to deal with the aftermath of their own psychological scars. But here's the kicker. Even though the job was taxing on your mind, the work you did had a profound impact. The fact that you were decoding messages, disrupting enemy plans, and helping the Allies gain crucial intelligence meant that you were directly influencing the war in ways that few people could even imagine. Still, the weight of it all would weigh heavily on your conscience. The secrets, the isolation, the endless days and nights would all linger with you long after the war ended. Many codebreakers left their jobs and tried to move on, but the mental scars of their service would follow them. They didn't get to share their stories, to relive their victories, or to ever fully recover from the mental strain. For some, it was simply too much. For others, it was a quiet reminder of the sacrifices they made and the hidden history they left behind. When we talk about World War II heroes, we often think of the soldiers on the front lines, the generals making strategic decisions, and the civilians contributing to the war effort. But the codebreakers were fighting a different kind of battle, a mental, emotional, and intellectual battle. And it was a battle that took a toll on their well-being, both during the war and long after. You would have been up against your own limits, constantly pushing yourself to the brink, all while knowing that your efforts would likely go unnoticed by the world. It wasn't about glory. Now, let's shift gears for a moment and talk about the life of isolation you'd face as a World War II codebreaker. Picture this: you're stuck in a room, alone, with nothing but the rhythmic clicking of your typewriter or the soft hum of an Enigma machine. Outside the walls, the world is bustling, but you're cut off, alone in a world made of codes, ciphers, and endless strings of numbers. No one really knows what you're doing, and you can't talk about it even if you wanted to. That was the nature of the work, a deep, dark secret that only a select few were ever meant to know. This wasn't just a day job, where you went home to your family at night and shared stories over dinner. No, this was a different kind of existence. You were part of something far bigger, something far more secretive, and that came with a price. The work was draining, but the isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of it all. Imagine spending days, weeks, and months in a room with no one to talk to but yourself and your thoughts. The loneliness was deafening. You wouldn't have the luxury of chatting about your day or sharing your successes with a friend. Instead, your victories and failures were internal solitary achievements that were often unrecognized. You might crack a code, but you couldn't go out and high-five your colleagues. They were likely in their own isolated rooms, battling their own codes. At first, you might think this solitude would be a relief, a quiet place to focus without distractions. But as the days dragged on, you'd start to feel the weight of it. Humans are social creatures, and even the most introverted among us need interaction from time to time. But not if you were a World War II codebreaker. You'd live in isolation, with only your mind to keep you company. It's not just about being physically alone, it's about the emotional toll that comes with not being able to share your struggles or triumphs. It's the feeling that no one truly understands what you're going through, that no one can relate to the pressure, the exhaustion, or the constant fear of failure. And let's not even talk about the paranoia. Isolation breeds suspicion. When you're constantly surrounded by secrets, you begin to question everyone. Is that person you're working with really on your side? What if they're a spy? What if your breakthroughs are being stolen? The weight of this mistrust is another aspect of isolation you'd have to carry. Every colleague could potentially be someone you couldn't fully trust. It's hard to form meaningful relationships in that environment. You'd have to trust no one, not completely. And this constant doubt would eat away at your sense of self. The secrecy wasn't just about the work. It was about the entire environment. You were hidden away in bunkers, tucked into remote locations, working under layers of security that made the outside world feel like a distant memory. There was no visibility. You weren't allowed to talk to anyone, not even family members. No one could know what you were doing. You couldn't share the hardships you were facing. No, your job was to stay quiet, stay focused, and keep your mouth shut. And let's be honest, that kind of secrecy wasn't just tiring. It was downright suffocating. But isolation didn't just affect you emotionally. It had physical consequences too. The long hours in cramped rooms, the constant stress, and the mental strain would take a toll on your body. Sitting for hours on end, with no chance to stretch your legs, no sunlight to soak in, no fresh air. It's a lifestyle that can break a person. Over time, your body would start to rebel against the sedentary, high-pressure routine. But there was no time to focus on your health. You'd just keep going, keep working, because the war didn't stop for a coffee break, let alone a doctor's visit. Let's not forget the toll on your mental health, either. All that isolation and pressure could lead to burnout, stress, and, eventually, mental collapse. Constantly staring at the same codes, day in and day out. Knowing that one mistake could change everything would erode even the most resilient mind. And while some codebreakers managed to keep it together, many others didn't. The toll of the work wasn't just physical, it was emotional and psychological. You'd have to endure the mental grind without the usual comforts of human connection, making it one of the most grueling aspects of the job. And while some codebreakers managed to soldier through, many cracked under the pressure. The isolation, the stress, and the sheer mental exhaustion were too much for a lot of people. And who could blame them? And there's something else to consider. Being cut off from the world meant you never got the full picture. You were so focused on the job, on cracking the codes, that you lost touch with what was happening outside. Sure, you'd hear the occasional rumor about the progress of the war, but most of the time, you had no idea what was going on. The men fighting on the front lines, the families back home, they had their own reality. You were in a different world altogether, cut off from it, physically and emotionally. The real kicker, though, even when the war ended and the codebreakers' work came to light, most of them were forgotten. They were the quiet heroes, the ones who worked behind the scenes without ever getting the credit they deserved. Their triumphs were never celebrated publicly. Their names were never immortalized in history books the way soldiers' names were. They were left to fade into obscurity. The isolation wasn't just during the war. It continued long after the war ended, and that's a hard reality to face when you're working in a job that demands so much from you, physically, mentally, and emotionally. It's tough to accept that you may never get the recognition you deserve. But that was the life of a World War II codebreaker, hidden away. Now that you have a sense of the mental and emotional toll, let's talk about recognition, or rather, the complete lack of it. If you were a codebreaker during World War II, you were living in the shadows. The world around you was loud, chaotic, and filled with stories of soldiers storming beaches, heroes fighting on the front lines, and the drama of warfare unfolding in real time. But you were tucked away, hidden in rooms filled with machines and numbers, working tirelessly without any acknowledgement from the outside world. In fact, the work you did was so secretive that you couldn't even talk about it, not even to your family or friends. Imagine dedicating yourself to something so monumental, yet never being able to share it with anyone. You were completely invisible. In those intense, pressure-filled moments when you cracked a code, saved a mission, or intercepted vital intelligence, there was no applause, there was no cheering from the sidelines. Instead, you'd quietly pass your work along to a superior, and that was that. Your victory, your contribution to the war effort, would go unnoticed by most. Even your colleagues, who were working on similar tasks, might not fully understand the magnitude of what you had accomplished. You'd be stuck in this world of unspoken success, where you were forced to rely on your own internal satisfaction. And while that might have felt rewarding in some small way, it wasn't nearly enough. You had no chance to celebrate, no chance to share the glory with anyone. The silence of the room was deafening, and so were the sacrifices that came with it. But it wasn't just about being unseen in the moment. It was about being erased from history. After the war ended, most of the codebreakers never received the recognition they deserved. Many of them returned to civilian life, to jobs they didn't particularly care about, without so much as a thank you for the critical work they had done. The war ended, and their contributions were forgotten by all but a select few. The truth was, they weren't just fighting the enemy, they were fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged for their efforts. But when the war was over, their quiet, unseen work was buried in secrecy. The code-breaking teams at places like Bletchley Park, for example, were shrouded in so much confidentiality that many of the people who had worked there couldn't even tell their own families what they had done for years. The government kept their efforts classified, and so their roles remained a mystery to the world for decades. When the world celebrated the end of the war, when soldiers were hailed as heroes and celebrated for their bravery, the codebreakers went home quietly, without fanfare. You were left with the knowledge that your hard work, your sacrifices, and your intellect had contributed to the Allied victory, but no one would ever know it. You had no medals, no public recognition, and no memorials to your name. For many codebreakers, it felt like they had done the impossible, only to be swept aside in favor of more glamorous war stories. You had given everything to a cause that no one could even openly acknowledge, and that, in itself, was perhaps the greatest sacrifice of all. And it wasn't just a case of not getting medals. It was about the fact that you had no closure. You never saw the full picture of your work. You didn't get to witness the effects of your breakthroughs in real time. If you broke a code that led to a successful mission, you wouldn't know the impact until months, maybe even years later, if you ever knew at all. You had no control over how your work was used, and you never got the chance to witness the fruits of your labor. All you had was your work, your skills, and the satisfaction of knowing that you had done your part to help win the war. But that satisfaction came at a price. complete anonymity. As the years passed and World War II became a part of history, the role of codebreakers remained largely overlooked. The public focus was on the soldiers who fought in battles and the generals who made strategic decisions. Meanwhile, the intellectual warriors, the people who cracked the codes, uncovered the enemy's secrets, and helped turn the tide of the war remained unknown. In fact, it wasn't until decades later that the work done by codebreakers was finally acknowledged. And even then, it was only a small number of them who received recognition for their monumental contributions. By then, many of the codebreakers had moved on, and the truth about their work had been hidden for so long that it felt almost like a forgotten chapter of history. For those who had spent their entire careers dedicated to breaking codes and saving lives, the lack of recognition was devastating. You did the hard work, you saved lives, but in the end, no one would ever truly know. You were left to fade into the background, uncelebrated, unknown, and unthanked. Now, imagine that. Imagine doing something so critical, so important, and yet never having the chance to tell anyone, never being able to say, "I helped win the war." No medals, no parades, no public acknowledgement. Instead, you return to normal life, with the knowledge that the world will never fully understand the depth of what you contributed. It's not just about the lack of recognition, it's, now that we've covered the mental and emotional strain and the lack of recognition, let's explore something that, ironically, might have made your job as a World War II codebreaker a little easier if it weren't for the constant threat of espionage. Spies, enemy agents, infiltrators, the very idea that someone could be working against you while you're working toward the greater good creates an environment of tension and fear. If you were a codebreaker, you never truly knew who you could trust. Even your own colleagues, with whom you were supposed to share a common cause, were suspected of being compromised. Imagine the constant paranoia that would arise from this. Every piece of paper you passed along, every word you spoke, was a potential leak. You would never have been able to rest easy, not when the stakes were so high. Even the most innocuous conversation could turn into an opportunity for espionage. A slip of the tongue could reveal your strategy, your next step, or your progress in decoding a message. If you were a codebreaker, you would be in a constant state of suspicion, wondering whether you were working for the right cause, or whether someone you trusted was actually working for the enemy. The concept of loyalty became distorted, and it was easy to feel like no one was truly on your side. The fear of espionage was not just a psychological burden, it was a very real danger. You could work for days, weeks, or months on a code, only for it to be compromised by an enemy agent who had infiltrated your operation. And it wasn't just the fear of having your work stolen. It was the fear of having your entire operation sabotaged. Imagine dedicating your life to cracking the enemy's codes, only to have that work taken, altered, or destroyed by someone who wanted the opposite outcome. The stakes were incredibly high, and your worst enemy wasn't always the one on the other side of the line. It was sometimes the person sitting right next to you. And even when you thought you were safe, there was always the looming question: what if someone had already gotten to your data? What if your work had been sabotaged long before it reached the higher-ups? The fear of espionage created a wall of secrecy so thick that even the most mundane actions could be fraught with suspicion. You couldn't trust anyone completely. If you were a codebreaker, you had to maintain a level of distance from everyone around you. After all, the enemy might already be inside the walls, working to undo all the progress you had made. It's no wonder that many codebreakers began to doubt everything around them. Your colleagues could be working just as hard as you, But how would you know if one of them was secretly feeding information to the other side? Espionage didn't just happen behind closed doors, it was often present in plain sight. You might have sat next to a colleague for months, exchanging ideas, cracking codes together, only to find out later that they had been compromised. They could have been feeding information to the enemy, and you would never have known. This level of mistrust is exhausting, especially when you're already working under extreme pressure to crack codes and stay ahead of the game. It's a constant state of vigilance, where nothing and no one could be taken at face value. And here's the kicker. Sometimes the threat wasn't just about the spies you knew about, but the ones you didn't even realize existed. The enemy could plant moles without anyone ever catching on, and their work could unravel everything you had done. They were always lurking, always waiting for the right moment to strike. It was like being on the front lines without ever really knowing where the danger was coming from. The paranoia was constant, the fear ever present. But even if you were lucky enough to avoid a direct spy, there was still the lingering possibility that your enemy had figured out your tactics. The Germans, for example, were constantly innovating, developing new ways to protect their messages and to detect codebreakers. As you cracked one encryption system, they were already thinking of ways to make your next mission harder. So, while you were busy fighting the mental battle of deciphering codes, the enemy was just as focused on fighting a psychological battle of their own. And, of course, espionage was always a part of that. You had to consider the possibility that your every move was being watched. Even when you weren't directly aware of it, the reality of espionage meant that even small mistakes could have grave consequences. If you misinterpreted a code or failed to notice a crucial detail, the enemy could take advantage of your slip-up. They might be feeding false information back into your code-breaking system, hoping to lead you astray and causing you to waste valuable time. You couldn't let your guard down. The fear that you were being watched or manipulated in some way added a layer of complexity to an already challenging job. It made everything feel uncertain. Nothing was ever as it seemed. Even when you thought you had a breakthrough, there was always the nagging doubt that the whole thing could have been part of a trap. The enemy was just as smart, just as calculating. Now that we've covered the pressure of espionage and the unrelenting tension of secrecy, let's dive into something a bit more unexpected: the role of women in the world of World War II codebreaking. When you think of a codebreaker, you probably imagine a man hunched over a machine, surrounded by stacks of papers and the hum of a cryptographic device in the background. But in reality, many of the most skilled and dedicated codebreakers during World War II were women. And they weren't just doing the grunt work, they were at the heart of the operation, contributing in ways that changed the course of history. The work they did wasn't recognized at the time, and many were later overlooked in the grand narrative of the war. But these women were just as integral to the success of the Allied forces as their male counterparts. The first thing you need to understand is that the role of women in World War II codebreaking wasn't a novelty. They weren't just filling in roles because men were away fighting. They were trusted with the most challenging, crucial aspects of the code-breaking process. Some of these women were recruited directly from universities or specialized programs. Many were mathematicians, linguists, and scholars who were well suited to the task. In fact, many of them were arguably the brightest minds of their time, people like Mavis Beatty, who played a pivotal role in deciphering the German Enigma codes. These women were solving some of the most complex cryptographic puzzles in the world, often under extreme pressure and with minimal recognition. One of the most significant contributions came from the women who worked at Bletchley Park, the British codebreaking center. While the work done at Bletchley Park is often remembered for the groundbreaking efforts of figures like Alan Turing, it's important to recognize that women played a key role in breaking the German codes as well. Thousands of women were hired during the war to help decode encrypted messages. They were responsible for scanning the incoming intelligence, sorting it, and applying mathematical algorithms to help break the codes. Some worked tirelessly on deciphering complex patterns, while others performed the critical work of checking the decoded messages for accuracy. Without them, the code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park would have been severely limited. Despite their immense contributions, these women weren't given the recognition they deserved. Many were asked to sign non-disclosure agreements and were forbidden from talking about their work, even to their families. This meant that they were not only working in isolation and under extreme pressure, but they were also denied any credit for their heroic efforts. After the war, many of these women returned to their everyday lives, never receiving the praise or acknowledgement they earned. It wasn't until decades later, when declassified documents revealed the extent of their involvement, that their contributions came to light. For most of them, the recognition came too late, long after the war had ended and their work was already buried in the past. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the women's involvement in World War II codebreaking was the sheer scale of their efforts. At the height of Bletchley Park's operations, around 9,000 women were working there, often in critical roles. They were tasked with deciphering codes, maintaining databases, and conducting analysis on enemy communications. Many of these women had no prior experience in cryptography, but they were trained quickly and worked with incredible precision. They were integral to the team that managed to crack the Enigma code, and their work laid the foundation for future advancements in computer science and cryptography. In fact, the work done by women in Bletchley Park is now considered some of the earliest groundwork for the development of modern computing. Despite their pivotal role, the narrative of World War II codebreaking often glosses over the contributions of women. Alan Turing, a central figure in the development of code-breaking techniques, is widely celebrated, but women like Joan Clarke, who worked alongside him and helped crack codes, are often left out of the historical conversation. Clarke, for instance, was one of Turing's closest collaborators at Bletchley Park. She was instrumental in deciphering the Enigma machine's codes, and is now recognized as one of the unsung heroes of the war effort. Yet, for decades, her story was largely forgotten. Why did this happen? The answer lies partly in the gender norms of the time. Women were often relegated to secondary roles, with their work deemed less significant or worthy of recognition. Even when they were working alongside the men who would eventually receive fame, their contributions were overshadowed by the cultural expectations of the era. The work of women was essential, but it was often dismissed as support work, or even though they were responsible for some of the most complex and vital tasks in the code-breaking effort. There's also the issue of secrecy. The women who worked at Bletchley Park were asked to keep their work classified, meaning they couldn't even tell their families what they were doing. This not only erased their recognition during the war, but it also left them in a strange limbo after the conflict ended. Most codebreakers had to return to normal life without a sense of closure or acknowledgement for their efforts. But for the women of Bletchley Park, there was an added layer of frustration. They had contributed in ways that were just as important as their male colleagues, yet they had little to show for it. They didn't get to be part of the war's public narrative. They didn't get a parade or a medal. All they had was the quiet knowledge that their work had helped end the war. And that was some. Let's take a step back and talk about the impact that cryptography had on World War II warfare. and the profound influence it had on the way the war unfolded. As a codebreaker, you were working in a world where information was more powerful than weapons. The fate of entire battles could rest on whether you deciphered a single encrypted message in time. You weren't on the front lines, wielding rifles or leading charges, but you were every bit as important to the war effort as those who were. The work you did, deciphering enemy communications, wasn't just about uncovering their plans, it was about turning the tide of entire conflicts. One of the most significant aspects of codebreaking during World War II was its direct impact on military strategies and operations. The interception and decryption of enemy communications meant that entire military operations could be preemptively thwarted. Imagine knowing the enemy's movements before they did. Imagine being able to predict their next steps, not based on guesswork or instinct, but on the very messages they thought were secure. It was as if you were reading their playbook. The ability to understand the enemy's plans before they could carry them out gave the Allies a critical advantage in many battles. Take the Battle of Midway, for example. The Japanese military was using encrypted messages to plan an attack, but the codebreakers at the United States Navy were able to crack their code. This allowed the Americans to know exactly where and when the attack would take place, giving them an edge that ultimately led to a decisive victory. But what if the codebreakers hadn't been able to decode those messages? What if they had missed a crucial piece of the puzzle? The outcome of the battle could have been very different. This is just one example, but there were many others where code-breaking turned the tide of the war. In fact, historians still debate just how much of an impact code-breaking had on the Allied victory. Some argue that it was instrumental in shortening the war and saving countless lives. Others believe that while code-breaking played a crucial role, it was only part of a larger web of military strategies, tactics, and fortuitous events that led to victory. Regardless of where you stand in that debate, there's no denying the importance of the work that was done in secret, behind closed doors. But what's really fascinating is the fact that code-breaking didn't just help in battles. It played a crucial role in shaping the overall strategy of the war. The intelligence gathered from decrypted messages helped guide decisions on where to allocate resources, where to send troops, and how to coordinate international efforts. The ability to read the enemy's communications allowed the Allies to stay one step ahead, anticipating attacks and shifting strategies as needed. It wasn't just about winning battles, it was about winning the war by outthinking and outmaneuvering the enemy at every turn. Now, imagine being in the shoes of a codebreaker. You're sitting in a small, quiet room, the world outside oblivious to the monumental work you're doing. The messages you decrypt, the codes you cracked, these are the secrets that will ultimately help your side prevail. And yet, you'll never be able to fully appreciate the fruits of your labor. The decisions that are made with the intelligence you provide will affect lives, entire nations, and the course of history. But you'll never know exactly how your work changed the world. You'll never know whether a single message you deciphered was the key to victory in a battle, or whether your analysis led to a shift in strategy that saved lives. You'll never be able to stand on a podium and receive the recognition you deserve. In a way, this lack of recognition made the job even harder. As a codebreaker, you weren't just working to solve puzzles, you were working to change the world, and yet you wouldn't get to see the full impact of your work. The decisions made based on your efforts would shape the future of millions of people, but you wouldn't be there to witness it. You'd be left to wonder whether your contribution truly made a difference. It's a strange kind of heroism, isn't it? The kind that's anonymous, uncelebrated. and ultimately forgotten. Despite all this, the significance of code breaking in World War II can't be overstated. The work done in those quiet rooms, the long hours spent deciphering enemy messages, had a profound impact on the outcome of the war. Without codebreakers, the war would have been very different. Entire campaigns could have failed, and the balance of power might have shifted in ways that could have had devastating consequences. The war was, in many ways, fought on the battlefield of information as much as it was fought with guns, tanks, and aircraft. And those who worked in the shadows, cracking codes and gathering intelligence, were every bit as important to the war effort as the soldiers who fought on the front lines. The legacy of World War II codebreakers is far-reaching. Their work not only helped win the war, but it also laid the foundation for modern cryptography, computer science, and intelligence work. The breakthroughs that were made in cryptography during the war led to the development of technologies that are still in use today. The early work on code breaking during World War II would go on to influence the development of computers, the internet, and modern encryption systems. The minds of the codebreakers, the hours they spent deciphering codes, changed the course of history in ways that continue to shape the world we live in today. So, as a codebreaker, you might have been isolated, underappreciated, and working in a world of constant pressure and secrecy, but your contributions had an impact that cannot be denied. The information you uncovered, the codes you cracked, the intelligence you gathered, helped shape the course of the war, and ultimately, the course of history. And while you may never have received the recognition you deserved, your legacy lives on in the systems we rely on today. If you could have looked back at your work, you'd realize that your quiet, unseen efforts were just as critical to the outcome of World War II as the bravery and valor shown on the front lines. By now, we've explored the monumental challenges of being a World War II codebreaker, the mental strain, the paranoia of espionage, the lack of recognition, and the isolation. But now, let's dive into one of the most unsettling aspects of the job, the dangers of mistakes. When you think about code breaking during World War II, you might picture a person hunched over a machine, furiously deciphering ciphers, but what you might not realize is that every error could be catastrophic. This wasn't just a job where a small mistake meant a little extra work. It meant the potential for massive, deadly consequences. If you got it wrong, the enemy could gain the upper hand. If you misinterpreted the message, you could mislead the Allies into taking the wrong actions. And the worst part, you wouldn't even know if you'd made the mistake until it was too late. The pressure of knowing that every keystroke, every calculation, could alter the course of history was overwhelming. Imagine spending hours, days, even weeks working on a single message, hoping that you were on the right track. You'd be carefully calculating each move, scanning for any possible patterns, trying to make sense of a seemingly endless string of letters and numbers. And then, just when you thought you had it, you'd discover that that one error, that tiny slip-up, could set back your progress by days or even weeks. In the world of cryptography, where every moment counted, mistakes weren't just frustrating, they were dangerous. Now, think about the stakes for a moment. Every time you cracked a code, you were unlocking secrets that could shape military strategies and operations. But if you made an error, the results could be disastrous. It wasn't just about your failure to crack a code. It was about the larger consequences of your mistake. If you misunderstood an enemy message, you could be leading the Allied forces into a trap. misdirecting them at a crucial moment. Imagine the weight of knowing that a single misstep could result in the loss of thousands of lives. The lives of soldiers on the front lines could be in your hands. And yet, you had to keep going, hoping that your calculations were correct, that your instincts were right, and that you weren't about to make a mistake that would haunt you for the rest of your life. This fear of error was a constant companion for codebreakers, and it was one of the reasons why many of them burned out so quickly. The mental strain of knowing that any misstep could lead to disaster was exhausting. And it wasn't just about individual mistakes. If you failed to crack a code, or worse, if you misinterpreted a critical message, it wasn't just your own reputation on the linnet was the success of the entire war effort. The weight of that responsibility was immense, and it was something that codebreakers carried with them every day. And the thing is, the margin for error was slim. The codes you were dealing with were so complex, so intricate, that even the smallest mistake could have massive consequences. The Enigma machine, for example, had thousands of possible settings, each one generating a different encryption for every letter in a message. One wrong letter, one wrong shift in the code, and the entire message could be misread. In the world of code breaking, a single mistake could send you on a wild goose chase for hours, or even days, wasting precious time and potentially compromising the entire operation. The pressure to get it right wasn't just psychological, it was strategic. But mistakes weren't always obvious. Sometimes you wouldn't even know you had made a mistake until it was too late. For example, imagine that you had cracked a code, and you were confident in your solution. You pass it along to the higher-ups, and they make decisions based on your work. But then, months later, it's discovered that a small misstep in your calculations led to a misinterpretation of a crucial message. The strategic decisions made from your code were wrong, and the consequences of those decisions played out on the battlefield. You wouldn't know the full extent of the damage your mistake caused until it was too late to fix it. The fear of mistakes also contributed to the paranoia we discussed earlier. In a world where you couldn't trust anyone completely, the fear of making a mistake often turned inward. Were your instincts right? Was your work thorough enough? Did you double-check every possible solution? Now that we've talked about the immense pressure of making mistakes and the dangers it posed, let's turn our focus to another vital yet often overlooked aspect of being a codebreaker: the peculiar language and the unique culture of codebreaking. In the world of espionage, words have power, and codebreakers had their own language. You see, cryptography isn't just about cracking codes. It's about creating a system of communication that is so complex, so intricate, that it's practically impenetrable. But within the world of codebreakers, there was a language all its own, developed out of necessity and secrecy. And that language, with its own codes, terms, and methods, was part of what made the job so fascinating and so confusing. Imagine working in a world where the meaning of every word, every term, every instruction could change depending on the context. You'd be surrounded by a jumble of codes and technical jargon that few others could understand. Terms that were used casually in your work might seem like gibberish to anyone on the outside. And this wasn't just a matter of specialized language, it was a barrier to communication, a way to ensure that information remains secure. As a codebreaker, you had to speak in a language that no one else would understand. You couldn't just call things by their regular names. You had to speak in a code of your own, a special dialect developed to keep the work under wraps. Take the term cryptanalyst, for instance. This is what codebreakers were often called, but to the outside world, it was just a word. To you, though, it meant something much deeper. You weren't just someone who worked with codes, you were someone who understood the logic and the theory behind them. You were a problem solver, a puzzle master, someone who could see patterns where others saw only confusion. But the language you used to describe your work had layers of meaning that couldn't be conveyed in a simple conversation. You had your own way of talking about cryptographic techniques, methods of decryption, and even the types of ciphers you were working with. It was a language that had to be learned, one that you shared with only a select group of people. But it wasn't just about the technical terms. The very way codebreakers communicated with each other was steeped in secrecy. Conversations were often carried out in coded messages themselves. It wasn't enough to just write down the decrypted messages. You had to encode them again for transmission to other codebreakers or military officials. It was a never-ending cycle of decryption and re-encryption, a dance of information that was both exhausting and essential. You couldn't just hand over a decoded message to someone and trust that it would be understood. You had to ensure that your message was still secure, that it couldn't be intercepted and understood by enemy agents. Imagine being in that world, where every word you spoke could be a potential piece of a larger puzzle. You couldn't just throw around jargon casually, because the meaning behind every term had weight. If someone misinterpreted your instructions, if you misused a term, it could throw the entire operation off course. And yet, despite all this complexity, the language of code-breaking was also a form of camaraderie, a way of bonding with others who shared the same intense focus on cracking codes. The shared understanding of this language created a unique culture within the walls of code-breaking operations. It was a culture built on secrecy, precision, and trust. But there was also a sense of isolation that came with this language. The very act of speaking in code created a barrier between you and the outside world. You couldn't share what you were doing with just anyone. Even if you tried to explain your work to someone outside your circle, they wouldn't understand. You'd be left with this sense of isolation, knowing that you were part of something monumental, something world-changing, but that the outside world would never truly understand the significance of your work. You were isolated, not just physically, but intellectually. The language you used set you apart from everyone else, and in a way that made the work even more difficult. But it wasn't just about speaking in code, it was about the personal connections you made with others in the same field. While you may have been working in isolation, you still had a shared purpose with those around you. Codebreakers often formed close-knit teams, working together to crack the enemy's messages. You'd learn to rely on each other, to trust each other, even though you weren't always able to express your feelings openly. The unique language of code-breaking helped build a sense of solidarity in an otherwise solitary job. But even within that team, you were still surrounded by secrecy. You had to trust that everyone was doing their part. But there was always a layer of doubt, a sense that you couldn't be completely open with anyone. Let's shift gears and delve into something that many may not immediately think about when considering the life of a World War II codebreaker: the dehumanizing nature of the work. On the surface, cracking codes seems like a thrilling intellectual game of wits against the enemy. But the reality was much more grim. You weren't looking at battlefields. You weren't seeing the faces of the soldiers. And you weren't hearing the cries of victory or defeat, disconnected from the real-world consequences they had. Imagine working day after day, immersed in the mechanical process of breaking codes. Your entire focus would be on patterns and figuring out the logic behind the enemy's encryption. You would spend hours staring at a page full of symbols, numbers, and letters, with only your mind and your training to guide you. You weren't thinking about the soldiers who would be impacted by your work. You weren't thinking about the families waiting for their loved ones to come home. You were trapped in a world of abstraction. The human element was lost in the pursuit of logic and precision. The further you went into the world of code breaking, decoded message you read was potentially life-changing or life-ending for someone. The lives of soldiers, entire battalions, even cities, could be altered by one small mistake in deciphering. But none of that mattered to you in the moment. You weren't dealing with the reality of warfare. You were dealing with numbers. And over time, the constant barrage of encrypted messages would strip away the emotional connection to the people affected by your work. This dehumanization wasn't just a matter of not seeing the impact of your work. It was part of the very nature of code breaking itself. You weren't allowed to think about the bigger picture. You couldn't imagine the people behind the messages. You couldn't focus on the emotional weight of what you were doing. The work was too demanding. It was too urgent. The enemy wasn't human to you. The idea of empathy or understanding the human consequences of your actions was secondary to the task at hand. Breaking the code, finding the pattern, staying ahead of the enemy. The irony here is that you were working to protect people, to save lives, but you were forced to disconnect from the very idea of those lives. You couldn't allow yourself to get bogged down by emotions. You couldn't afford to let your mind wander to the faces of soldiers, to the families back home. The pressure to keep your focus sharp and your work flawless left little room for reflection on the human side of things. This kind of mental detachment, while necessary for the job, created a disconnect that would be hard to shake. You were part of a larger effort, yes, but you were also a small cog in an enormous machine that stripped away any sense of individual impact. But here's the problem. You couldn't avoid that human side forever. As much as the work demanded that you remain detached, the reality was that the work you were doing had real consequences. You couldn't pretend that the intelligence you deciphered wasn't being used to make life and death decisions. You couldn't ignore the fact that the military was using your work to plan attacks, make strategic decisions, and coordinate missions. You were indirectly influencing the course of the war and, by extension, the lives of millions of people. It wasn't just numbers and symbols, it was lives. And that knowledge had a way of creeping into your mind. No matter how hard you tried to block it out, imagine the dissonance that would come from working on this kind of abstract, dehumanizing task while also knowing the impact your work had. You were too busy solving the puzzle, figuring out the next step, that you couldn't see the faces of the people you were ultimately working for. The disconnect between the work and the people was a constant challenge. It was the kind of emotional toll that wore down many codebreakers, leaving them feeling numb, detached, and ultimately exhausted. And then there's the question of what happened after the war ended. Imagine returning to civilian life after being immersed in this kind of work for years. You've spent all this time in a world of abstract patterns, codes, and numbers. You've disconnected from the human element of the war. The world has moved on, and you're left to try to reintegrate into a society that has very different concerns. How do you make that transition when your entire perspective has been shaped by a world where emotions were secondary to intellect? How do you reconnect with the real world after spending so long in an abstract one? For many codebreakers, this emotional detachment wasn't just temporary, it became permanent. The isolation, the pressure, the constant focus on logic and reason, it all left its mark. Some codebreakers struggled to reconnect with their emotions after the war. The war had been won, but the toll it took on their minds and hearts couldn't easily be erased. They had spent so long in a world where the human side of things was suppressed that it was hard to face the realities of life after the war. But what's perhaps most striking is that this dehumanizing aspect of code breaking was often invisible. To the outside world, code breakers were unsung heroes. Let's now take a step back and explore one of the most unique aspects of World War II code breaking: the shifting nature of technology. The world of cryptography was in constant flux, with each breakthrough being met by the enemy's rapid response. Every time you cracked a code, the enemy would adapt, find a new way to encrypt their messages, and the cycle would start over. It was an intellectual arms race, where the battle wasn't fought with bullets, but with mathematical formulas, algorithms, and machine intelligence. The nature of this technological warfare meant that you were always playing catch-up, constantly trying to stay ahead of the curve, knowing that the work you did today might already be obsolete tomorrow. The most obvious example of this technological battle was the Enigma machine. When it was first introduced, the Enigma appeared unbreakable. The German military had put their trust in this sophisticated device, which used a complex system of rotors to generate thousands of possible settings for each letter. The machine was designed to keep messages secure, and for a long time it succeeded. But when codebreakers at Bletchley Park, working around the clock under extreme pressure, finally cracked the Enigma code, it marked a pivotal moment in the war. Yet, that victory was short-lived. The Germans responded by constantly changing their encryption methods, making the job of codebreakers even harder. But it wasn't just the Enigma machine that was a problem. As soon as the Allies cracked one code, the Axis powers developed new machines, ciphers, and encryption systems. The war was an ongoing battle of technological innovation, with each side scrambling to develop more sophisticated ways of keeping their communications secure. The very nature of code breaking meant that your work was never really finished. You could spend days, weeks, or even months trying to crack a system, only for the enemy to change it, rendering all your work useless. Imagine the frustration of knowing that the technology you were using to break codes today could be outpaced by the enemy's technological advancements tomorrow. It was a constant race to stay ahead, and the stakes were incredibly high. You weren't just solving puzzles, you were racing against time, against the enemy, and against technological progress. Every moment counted, and every misstep could result in months of wasted work. The pressure to keep up with this technological arms race was enormous, and it often felt like you were trying to hit a moving target. What's more, this technological warfare extended beyond machines like the Enigma. Codebreakers also had to contend with the advent of more advanced encryption techniques. As the war progressed, the Germans and other Axis powers developed increasingly complex methods of securing their messages. Some of these methods involved not just mechanical devices, but mathematical formulas that required a deep understanding of mathematics and logic to crack. You weren't just dealing with ciphers anymore. You were grappling with entire systems that were designed to outsmart the brightest minds. In some ways, this technological evolution mirrored the development of modern computing. The breakthroughs that were made during World War II by codebreakers like Alan Turing laid the groundwork for the early development of computers. Turing, for example, didn't just crack codes, he created the first theoretical designs for what would become the modern computer. But while Turing's work on the bomb machine, which helped decrypt the Enigma, was groundbreaking, it was also a response to the rapid pace of technological change in the field of cryptography. The enemy's constant innovation pushed Turing and his colleagues to think in entirely new ways. They weren't just working with the technology of their time. They were also laying the foundation for the technology of the future. The rapid evolution of cryptographic technology during World War II meant that codebreakers were often working with the most cutting-edge equipment available, but that equipment was already outdated by the time they were using it. The sense of constantly playing catch-up was overwhelming. The work you did one day could be completely irrelevant the next. The mental fatigue that came with this constant adaptation was one of the most draining aspects of being a World War II codebreaker. You weren't just dealing with intellectual challenges, you were dealing with the feeling that no matter how much you achieved, the enemy would always be one step ahead. But the evolution of technology in World War II wasn't just a challenge, it was also a source of incredible innovation. In response to the demands of codebreaking, codebreakers had to develop new tools, new machines, and new methods. Turing's bomb, for example, was one of the first machines capable of automating the process of decrypting the Enigma codes. It was an invention that helped speed up the process of codebreaking and made it possible to handle the vast amounts of encrypted data coming in from all directions. But while the bomb was groundbreaking, it was. As we look deeper into the life of a World War II codebreaker, we can't ignore one of the most pervasive challenges: the emotional toll of the work. You might think that working on a critical piece of intelligence that could potentially save thousands of lives would bring a sense of pride, a sense of accomplishment. But here's the reality: there was very little time to feel that. The constant pressure, the hours of staring at codes, the isolation, the lack of recognition, these were all things that ate away at your emotional well-being. There was no pat on the back, no celebration for a job well done. Your success didn't come with applause, and your mistakes didn't have a chance to be rectified in real time. The emotional exhaustion from this isolation and constant mental grind was immense. In fact, the sheer emotional toll could easily be one of the most underestimated aspects of the job. First off, think about the sheer mental stamina required. You weren't just working on a couple of problems. You were working on countless messages, each one with its own set of complex encryption schemes. It wasn't just about cracking one code and being done. It was an ongoing, non-stop process. With the high stakes and constant mental strain, the fear of failure became a constant companion. Every time you looked at an encrypted message, you could feel the weight of responsibility. What if you missed something? What if you misinterpreted it? The reality was that the emotional pressure never let up. Each message you deciphered could change the course of a battle or even the war. And yet, there was no room for mistakes, no time to feel pride or relief. When you're isolated in a room with only your thoughts and the hum of machines to keep you company, the emotional isolation becomes almost unbearable. You weren't allowed to talk about your work to anyone. No friends, no family, not even your closest colleagues. You couldn't share the weight of the burden with anyone, not even if you were on the brink of exhaustion or emotional breakdown. The secrecy, while necessary, created a barrier between you and the rest of the world. You weren't allowed to express your frustration, your fatigue, or your fears. This led to a kind of emotional disconnect from everyone outside of the code-breaking circle. And it wasn't just the secrecy that wore you down, it was the long hours. Days could blend into nights, and weeks could pass in a blur as you worked tirelessly without any real sense of time. There was no time for breaks, no time for relaxation, no time for anything other than the code in front of you. This isolation, combined with the exhaustion of constant mental exertion, led many codebreakers to experience deep emotional fatigue. They were operating in a world where emotions were secondary to the task at hand. But it wasn't long before those emotions would catch up to them. This exhaustion didn't just affect your mood, it affected your mental sharpness. over time, the emotional toll could blur the line between what was real and what wasn't. You'd spend so much time interpreting ciphers, trying to crack messages, that it would become harder to separate the puzzle from reality. Your thoughts would become consumed with patterns, with letters, with numbers, and it would be difficult to switch off. The emotional toll of that kind of relentless focus often led to burnout, leaving codebreakers feeling emotionally numb, disconnected from the very people they were working to protect. And the worst part, you wouldn't even know if your work was making a difference. You'd be working in isolation, uncertain about whether your efforts would lead to anything substantial. You'd spend hours or days cracking a code, only to hand over your findings to someone who might never even tell you the results. You'd never know how your work impacted the war. The lack of immediate feedback, of tangible results, left many codebreakers feeling like their work didn't matter. Even the smallest mistake could feel like the end of everything, and without knowing the direct impact of their work, many codebreakers struggled with feelings of inadequacy and doubt. The emotional toll of working in such an environment wasn't just a side effect, it was part of the job. This emotional strain was baked into the very nature of the work. And here's the kicker. After the war ended, when codebreakers finally returned to civilian life, they were left to deal with the emotional scars in silence. There were no ceremonies to acknowledge their efforts, no recognition of the emotional exhaustion they had endured. For many, it was like the war had never ended. They were left with the aftermath of their work, without any outlet to express the feelings they had suppressed for so long. And while some codebreakers were able to move on and build new lives, for others, the emotional burden lingered, unresolved and unaddressed. But what's truly heartbreaking is that the emotional toll of being a codebreaker wasn't just about personal strain, it was about the lives you couldn't see, the families you couldn't help, and the emotional cost of being cut off from the very people you were working to protect. You were helping to win the war, yes, but you were doing it in a world that didn't allow you to be human, to be emotional. As we reach the final stretch of this journey through the world of World War II codebreakers, let's reflect on their lasting legacy. For decades, the work of these quiet heroes remained shrouded in secrecy. Their contributions were buried in classified files, their names left unspoken in the history books. Yet, despite the lack of recognition during and after the war, the impact of their work rippled through history in ways that can still be felt today. It wasn't just about cracking codes, it was about laying the foundation for the future of technology, intelligence, and even modern warfare. The codebreakers may have been hidden behind the veil of secrecy, but their influence extends far beyond the war itself. You see, the work done by World War II codebreakers didn't just help end the war, it laid the groundwork for the rise of modern computing and the field of cryptography. Alan Turing, for example, is often regarded as the father of theoretical computer science. His work at Bletchley Park, where he helped crack the Enigma machine, wasn't just a victory in the battle against the Axis powers, it was a revolutionary step in the development of computing. Was one of the first examples of a machine being used to process information at a scale never before seen. But it wasn't just Turing. The work of many other codebreakers, particularly the women at Bletchley Park, also contributed to the development of early computational technology. For instance, the Colossus machine, developed by Tommy Flowers and his team, was the first programmable digital electronic computer. It was designed to crack the Lorenz cipher, a more complex encryption system used by the Germans. The development of Colossus was a direct result of the intense need for faster, more efficient methods of decrypting messages during the war. Without the pressure of wartime code breaking, it's hard to imagine how quickly these technological advances would have come about. In a sense, the legacy of the codebreakers goes far beyond their impact on the war. The machines they built, the systems they developed, and the methods they pioneered became the building blocks of the computers, the internet, and the encryption systems we rely on today. What they did during the war wasn't just important for defeating the Axis, it was crucial in paving the way for the digital age. And yet, even though the legacy of codebreaking is so deeply tied to modern technology, it's still largely overlooked. The work of these codebreakers is often reduced to a footnote in the broader story of World War II. The public focus tends to be on the soldiers, the generals, and the battles that were fought on the front lines. But the reality is that the work of codebreakers was just as important. Without their tireless work behind the scenes, many of the key victories of World War II would have been impossible. The breaking of the Enigma code, the interception of German communications, and the decoding of vital intelligence all played a pivotal role in shortening the war and saving lives. The lives of soldiers on the front lines may have been directly impacted by battles, but they were indirectly shaped by the intelligence gathered and passed on by the codebreakers. But what's really remarkable about the legacy of World War II codebreakers is that it wasn't just about their technical abilities, it was about their resilience, their perseverance, and their willingness to sacrifice everything for the greater good. They worked long hours, often in isolation, without recognition or reward. And yet, despite all the pressure, the lack of recognition, and the emotional toll of the work, they carried on. They persevered in the face of uncertainty, in the face of burnout, and in the face of constant fear that they might fail. That perseverance, that quiet determination, is what truly defines their legacy. The codebreakers weren't just fighting a battle with their intellect, they were fighting an emotional battle as well. They had to balance the intellectual challenges of their work with the psychological toll of working in isolation, under constant pressure, with no immediate feedback or recognition. They had to keep pushing forward, day after day, with no guarantee of success and no way of knowing if their work would make a difference. They had to endure a kind of silent, emotional sacrifice that many never spoke about. Even after the war ended, it's no wonder that many codebreakers struggled with the aftermath of the war. They had given so much of themselves, mentally, emotionally, and intellectually, that the return to civilian life was often jarring. They had spent years working in a world of secrecy, in a world where their efforts went. As we've uncovered, the life of a World War II codebreaker wasn't merely about intellect, but about the mental and emotional endurance required to survive in a high-pressure, constantly evolving environment. We've talked about the mental strain, the constant tension of espionage, the lack of recognition, and the grueling isolation. But what we haven't fully explored yet is one of the most significant challenges of code breaking during World War II, the limited resources and tools at your disposal. This aspect of the job can be easy to overlook, especially when we think of the complex machines like the Enigma or the bomb that played such an iconic role in deciphering enemy communications. But imagine, if you will, a situation where, despite all your intelligence and skills, the tools you have to crack these codes are insufficient or outdated. This was a reality for most codebreakers working behind the scenes. The pressure to decode encrypted messages didn't just come from the enemy's ever-evolving encryption methods, it also came from the lack of cutting-edge technology. As a codebreaker, your success in cracking codes was heavily dependent on the machines and resources available to you. But those resources were far from perfect. Early code-breaking machines, like Turing's bomb and the Colossus, were groundbreaking in their time, but they didn't have the kind of processing power that we think of today. In fact, these machines were incredibly primitive by modern standards, and their construction was fraught with challenges. You might have felt the sting of frustration when you sat down to decode a message, only to realize that the machines you were working with were slow, cumbersome, and lacking in functionality. Your equipment was often underdeveloped and prone to breakdowns. For every brilliant innovation, there were limits on speed, processing power, and even the complexity of the codes they could handle. It wasn't just about cracking codes. It was about cracking codes with the tools available to you, which were far from ideal. The lack of resources extended beyond the machines themselves. There was also the issue of personnel. As the war dragged on, the demand for codebreakers grew exponentially, but the number of trained personnel remained limited. The pressure of this shortage was acutely felt. Many codebreakers, particularly women working in places like Bletchley Park, were tasked with decoding messages from multiple fronts. You were working under immense pressure, trying to decipher encrypted communications coming from all directions, sometimes with too few people and too much work. And while your counterparts on the front lines had to face physical combat, your battle was a battle of intellect, compounded by the ever-present threat of technological limitations. What this meant in practical terms was that your success in cracking enemy codes wasn't simply about being a genius or being dedicated to your work. It was about making the most out of what you had. You were working with what amounted to the technological equivalent of hand-me-downs, building off what little progress had been made before, adapting systems to suit your needs, and learning on the fly how to push those limits. This adaptability was a key trait for any codebreaker, and in many ways, it was a survival mechanism. The world of World War II codebreaking was one of constant improvisation. Your ability to think creatively in the face of limited resources was just as important as your ability to solve complex puzzles. The scarcity of resources also made teamwork incredibly important. In many ways, you were part of a very specialized network of people, all of whom were relying on one another to make the best use of the limited resources available. If you were at a place like Bletchley Park, you were working side by side with other brilliant minds, each contributing their skills and knowledge to a larger mission. But there was a catch. You couldn't afford to operate in isolation. Every person's work was interconnected, and each breakthrough, no matter how small, depended on collaboration. The work was intellectually taxing, and you were constantly sharing ideas, reviewing one another's work, and seeking ways to improve the machinery and techniques you used. Despite all the improvisation and collaboration, though there was an inevitable reality, your tools and resources were far behind the enemy's expectations. Imagine staring at a code that could be the key to winning the war, only to know that you weren't operating with the kind of equipment that could fully match the complexity of the task. This sense of limitation often led to frustration and burnout. Your team had to be resourceful, but there were only so many hours in a day, and only so much you could do with the tools available. As we've seen, the codebreakers of World War II operated in an environment where the stakes were unimaginably high. The work they did was pivotal in shaping the outcome of the war, and yet it was fraught with challenges that most of us today can't even begin to fathom. But amidst the intellectual and technological battles, there was one more aspect of the code-breaking world that cannot be overlooked: the ethical dilemmas that codebreakers faced. in the context of a total war where everything was a weapon. Even the information you decoded could have moral and ethical implications. As a codebreaker, you were constantly walking a fine line between loyalty, duty, and the consequences of your actions. One of the most pressing ethical issues was whether or not to share information with the military command. Codebreakers often cracked crucial enemy messages that could give the Allies the upper hand. But the decision of when and how to share this intelligence was never straightforward. There was always a risk that revealing certain pieces of information too soon could alert the enemy to the fact that their codes had been broken, giving them a chance to change their encryption methods. This dilemma meant that codebreakers didn't always have the luxury of full transparency. Sometimes, the success of an operation depended on withholding information from the enemy, but this also raised questions about the morality of deceiving those who might rely on that information. For example, if a codebreaker deciphered a message that revealed an upcoming enemy attack, it was tempting to pass that information along immediately so that the Allies could prepare. But what if that message also contained a clue that would let the Germans know their codes had been cracked? If the Allies acted on the information, they might thwart the attack, but they might also tip off the Germans and give them the opportunity to change their encryption methods. The ethical question then became, should the codebreaker risk exposing their breakthrough to protect the greater good, or should they hold back the information to preserve the security of the intelligence operation? This was a question that many codebreakers had to wrestle with during the war. But the ethical dilemmas weren't limited to the decisions about when to release information. Another key issue was the responsibility of codebreakers in handling intercepted communications that contained sensitive or personal information. While the majority of the messages you deciphered would be military or strategic in nature, there were occasional messages that touched on more personal matters, such as letters or communications from soldiers to their families. This created a tension between the military necessity of decoding enemy messages and the respect for privacy and human dignity. Codebreakers often had to decide whether to read these personal messages, knowing that doing so might provide valuable intelligence, or whether to avoid overstepping the boundaries of privacy. The temptation to gather as much information as possible was strong, but it came at the cost of respecting personal lives, something that wasn't always easy to reconcile with the urgency of wartime intelligence work. Moreover, the sheer weight of the decisions made based on decoded intelligence created ethical dilemmas in terms of collateral damage. When codebreakers cracked a message, they weren't just providing information, they were helping to shape military strategies. The intelligence that they uncovered could lead to decisive battles, but it could also result in civilian casualties. Imagine cracking a code that reveals the location of an enemy stronghold, only for that information to be used in a bomb raid that kills innocent civilians. These are the kinds of moral questions that codebreakers would have had to face, knowing that their work would have consequences beyond the battlefield. It wasn't just about cracking a code, it was about the ripple effect that the information would cause across the war. Another ethical issue revolved around the question of deception. The Allies had to constantly stay one step ahead of the Germans, and that sometimes meant using deception as part of their strategy. Codebreakers weren't just deciphering enemy messages. They were also involved in creating disinformation campaigns. For instance, the Allies would sometimes send misleading signals or fake communications in an attempt to confuse or mislead the enemy. This strategy was designed to create doubt in the enemy's mind, but it also meant that the lines between truth and deception were blurred. As a codebreaker, you might find yourself decoding messages that weren't entirely truthful. Or you might be part of an operation that created false information to feed to the enemy. The ethical implications of working with deception, especially when it was designed to mislead your adversaries, were significant. It raised the question of whether it was justifiable to manipulate the truth. As we near the end of our exploration of World War II codebreaking, it's time to look at one of the most vital aspects of the work that was often overlooked: the lasting impact of the codebreakers' contributions on modern intelligence and cryptography. The legacy of their work didn't just end with the conclusion of the war. No, their breakthroughs shaped the future of technology, military intelligence, and even the very ways we communicate today. These silent warriors, who toiled behind the scenes, left behind a blueprint for modern cryptography and paved the way for the digital world as we know it. It's easy to imagine the story of the Codebreakers as something isolated in a series of intellectual battles fought in the midst of World War II. But what's truly remarkable is how their work laid the foundation for the technologies that dominate our world today. The innovations that took place during the war, the machines and methods developed by codebreakers, eventually evolved into the very systems that power our modern world. Think about encryption today. It's everywhere, in our smartphones, computers, and even our financial systems. Without the breakthroughs of World War II codebreakers, we might not have the secure methods of communication that we rely on today. The foundational principles of encryption, many of which were first explored during the war, are now used to protect everything from online banking to personal data. The role of the codebreakers in developing the earliest stages of computing is perhaps one of their most overlooked legacies. The bomb machine, designed by Alan Turing, was an early example of computational technology, and it was a precursor to the computers that would later revolutionize the world. Turing's work in breaking the Enigma code was not just about winning the war. It was about creating the first stepping stones toward the modern computer. The principles of computation, algorithm design, and even artificial intelligence began to take shape during this period. It wasn't just about decrypting enemy communications. It was about the foundation of the technology that powers the information age. Today, even the act of code breaking itself was ahead of its time. The idea of trying to break a code, understand its structure, and find patterns in seemingly random data laid the groundwork for the field of computer science. Today, algorithms are used to analyze data, optimize systems, and solve complex problems, yet these techniques, which are common today, were born from the intense pressure of wartime cryptography. The codebreakers weren't just cracking codes. They were designing systems that would later become fundamental to how computers function. In fact, the whole concept of programming, debugging, and iterating was something codebreakers were intimately familiar with long before the public had access to modern computing technology. But it wasn't just about technology, it was about information. The intelligence gathered from codebreaking during World War II didn't just change the course of the war. It transformed the way intelligence is used in modern warfare. The ability to intercept and decode enemy communications gave military leaders the edge they needed to make strategic decisions. This concept of intelligence warfare continues to shape how we approach modern conflicts. The practices of espionage, interception, and decryption used during World War II remain crucial in today's geopolitical landscape, where information is just as powerful as weapons. The idea that knowledge is power and that controlling the flow of information is essential to winning was demonstrated during the war and is now ingrained in modern intelligence operations. In addition, The importance of secrecy and security in communications has taken on new urgency in the age of the Internet. We live in a world where cybersecurity is paramount, and the work done by World War II codebreakers to crack complex ciphers laid the groundwork for the encryption techniques used today to secure online communications. The same principles that helped decipher the Enigma code are now embedded in the systems that keep our digital lives safe. As technology advances, so does the sophistication of encryption systems. But the fundamental concepts, how to protect information from prying eyes, how to secure communications, were pioneered during the war. It's fascinating to think about how much of the digital infrastructure we take for granted today has its roots in those dark, quiet rooms where codebreakers worked tirelessly under enormous pressure. The concept of secure communication, of protecting sensitive information from unauthorized access, is as important today as it was during the war. The lessons learned in those war rooms are now being applied to protect everything from personal information to national security. But despite all these technological advancements, the legacy of the codebreakers is also tied to something intangible: their quiet heroism. They weren't fighting in battles or making headlines. They were working in the shadows, making small but crucial contributions that would ultimately change the course of history. They worked without recognition, sometimes without even knowing the full impact of their work, but they still persevered. Theirs was a job of intellectual endurance, of long hours and moments of frustration, all in the name of something much greater than themselves. And while the recognition came too late for many, the historical importance of their efforts is undeniable. What's more, the way they adapted to their circumstances, finding ways to innovate, to make do with limited resources, and to push the boundaries of technology, provides valuable lessons for us today. The codebreakers were not just brilliant minds. They were resilient and resourceful individuals who understood the importance of perseverance. They worked in an environment that demanded flexibility and creativity, and they succeeded in ways that still reverberate in the world of technology, security, and information. Perhaps the most fitting tribute to the legacy of World War. As we conclude this journey through the often hidden world of World War II codebreakers, it's important to reflect on what we've learned about their roles, their sacrifices, and their ultimate legacy. These individuals, often operating in complete secrecy, under extreme pressure, and with limited resources, were responsible for some of the most significant breakthroughs in intelligence and technology during the war. Their work not only helped shorten the conflict, but also laid the groundwork for the modern digital age. But perhaps the most powerful lesson we can take from their story is the realization that even the quietest contributions can have the most profound and lasting impact. Throughout this series, we've explored the many facets of being a World War II codebreaker: the mental strain, the pressure of making mistakes, the emotional toll of isolation and secrecy, and the ethical dilemmas faced daily. We've seen how codebreakers had to rely on their intellect, creativity, and resilience to break the most complex ciphers and provide crucial intelligence to the Allied forces. But we've also seen how their work, often done behind closed doors and without recognition, went on to shape the future of technology, cryptography, and military strategy. Yet, despite the importance of their contributions, many of the codebreakers went unrecognized during the war and for years afterward. The secrecy surrounding their work meant that their stories were left untold for decades, and many of them returned to civilian life without ever receiving the credit they deserved. In the end, their legacy is a testament to the quiet, often unseen contributions that individuals can make in times of crisis. While the world celebrated the victory of the Allies and the bravery of soldiers on the front lines, the true heroes behind the scenes, those working in the shadows of cryptography, remained largely unknown. But, as we've seen, the legacy of these unsung heroes continues to resonate today. Their work laid the foundation for modern computing, cryptography, and the way we protect sensitive information in the digital age. The machines they helped develop, like the bomb and the Colossus, were among the first examples of what would later become the computers we rely on today. Their methods of breaking codes and securing communications have been adapted and expanded upon to keep our digital lives safe, proving that the codebreakers of World War II didn't just influence the outcome of a war, they helped shape the landscape of the future. However, their contributions were not just limited to technology. The work of codebreakers changed the very way we think about intelligence and warfare. During the war, the ability to intercept and decode enemy messages became one of the most powerful tools in the Allies' arsenal. Today, intelligence gathering and the protection of sensitive information continue to play a crucial role in military strategy and national security. The importance of cryptography and cybersecurity, both on a global scale and within our personal lives, can be traced directly back to the breakthroughs made by these World War II codebreakers. In reflecting on the lives of the codebreakers, we must also acknowledge the personal cost of their work. The emotional strain, the long hours, the isolation, and the ethical dilemmas they faced each day took a toll on their well-being. Many codebreakers struggled with mental exhaustion, and the lack of recognition or acknowledgement of their efforts only compounded their struggles. It wasn't just the intellectual challenges that made their work so difficult. It was the emotional and psychological weight that came with being part of a team that worked in secrecy, often with no immediate feedback or recognition. For many codebreakers, the war ended and their roles were forgotten, left to fade into obscurity. Yet, their contributions have been increasingly recognized in recent years, as historians and scholars have pieced together the forgotten history of cryptography and intelligence during World War II. It's heartening to know that the stories of these brilliant minds are finally being told. And as more people learn about the quiet heroes of World War II codebreaking, we can be reminded of the invaluable role they played in shaping the course of history. As you reflect on their legacy, consider the broader implications of their work. The codebreakers weren't just solving puzzles or cracking codes, they were building the future. Their work was a form of quiet heroism, one that helped secure the safety of millions of people and ultimately helped bring about peace. The sacrifices they made, both personally and professionally, were immense, and their contributions continue to influence the world in ways they likely never imagined. In the grand narrative of World War II, they may have been largely invisible, but in the story of the modern world, their legacy is undeniable. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the true heroes of history are not always the ones who are celebrated in the spotlight. Sometimes, it's the quiet, intellectual battles fought behind closed doors, the small decisions made in silence that changed the world in profound ways. The World War II codebreakers were proof of that. A different kind of battle won with codes, ciphers, and machines, but their victory was just as significant. And their legacy, though long unrecognized, will continue to shape our world for years to come. As we come to the end of our journey through the hidden world of World War II codebreakers, let's take a moment to reflect on the quiet heroes who helped change the course of history without ever stepping foot on a battlefield. Their story is one of mental fortitude, emotional sacrifice, and unwavering dedication. These men and women cracked codes, gathered vital intelligence, and ultimately helped bring about an Allied victory. Yet, despite their monumental efforts, their names were largely forgotten, their contributions overshadowed by the more visible, celebrated aspects of the war. The life of a codebreaker was filled with challenges, from the constant pressure of making no mistakes to the isolation and emotional toll of working in secrecy, and the emotional sacrifice of never truly knowing the impact of their work. They were, in many ways, the unsung heroes of World War II, and although their stories weren't told in the history books at the time, they left a legacy that still shapes our world today. Their work wasn't just